Alright guys, welcome back. As I mentioned in my last video, I've been working on converting the rest of my Aeldari combat patrol so I can try and make a custom Aeldari Wraith army. And today I'm going to be converting and painting up my Wraith Guardians and Wraith Riders. And the way I was able to do this was I took an STL of the Wraith Lord helmet and helmet mount, and I was able to scale these down to the size I needed before printing them off. And they fit absolutely perfectly with the models, and they were exactly what I was looking for my Wraith themed army. So let's get into the painting. So the same drill applies as with the rest of the Mymeara army, and we're going to start off by creating a turquoise zenithal across all of the models, using the Army Painter Turquoise Triad. And we're going to start off with the darkest colour, which is Deep Azure, and we're just going to blast that over all of the models. And we want to cover around 95% of the model, just leaving the deepest recesses left in the black primer. The next coat's going to be of Turquoise Siren, and I apply this from the top of the model and at 45 degrees as well. And we're just slowly building up that coloured zenithal highlight and starting to hit all of the main highlight points on the models as well. And now we're going to apply a final highlight layer of Marine Mist, and we're just applying this from the top of the model, trying to hit all of the very highest of the highlight points. Next up, I'm going to be painting the sword, and off camera I base coated the entire sword in black in preparation for the upcoming steps, which is to firstly paint up the hilt and the handle of the sword using Army Painter Greedy Gold, and this should only need one coat. Next up, we're going to be working on the blade of the sword, and to do that I'm going to be glazing in the entire Army Painter Magenta Triad. And I'm just going to be using a wet palette for this, and the first thing that I'm going to be doing is just applying a solid base coat of the darkest colour in the Triad, which is the Diabolic Plumb. And I'm then just going to start to glaze in the rest of the colours in the Triad, working my way through the lighter colours. And the key here is just to make sure that you thin down your paints a little bit with water, and I'm just really using the water that the wet palette naturally provides. And you also just want to make sure that you don't overload your brush too much here with paint. So make sure you've got a paper towel or something like that to wick off any excess paint before applying it to the model. And as I said, I'm just working my way through the Triad colours, and with each step up in brightness in colour, I'm going to be covering a smaller surface area. And I'm also going to be using my brush strokes from the base of the sword and dragging the highlights towards the tip of the sword. And once you've applied the glaze, just make sure you do give it enough time to dry before applying the next layer. I myself did jump back and forward using a hairdryer here, just so I could speed up the drying process. And once you get to the tip of the sword and are applying the final highlight, you may notice that the final colour in the triad, which is Diviner Light, is quite a stark jump from the previous colour. So I just applied a little more than I would normally, and then went back in with my previous colour and glazed it back down to blend it in. Next up, it's time to apply some shading to the model, but before that I did paint in all of the areas I want white, which was any of the guns and any of the Wraithbone fins on the models. And I also applied a generous coat of gloss varnish to the entire model as well, which is going to help tremendously with the next step. In my previous videos I did use matte varnish instead of gloss varnish, and this was a bit of a mistake on my part, so I do apologise. So if you are following along with this tutorial, make sure you do use gloss varnish, as it does work a lot better for the next part. Which is to start to apply the weathering pigment, and as usual I'm going to be using Mr. Weathering Multi Black along with the solvent. And for this application I'm going to be mixing the pigment in 1:1 with the solvent. And you just want to take a large brush here and apply the weathering pigment over the entire model. And the fact that we used gloss varnish this time means that the pigment should flow a lot better across the model and find its way into all of the recesses. And the only area I didn't paint with this weathering pigment on the Guardian models was the blade of the sword. The rest of the model gets a generous coat. The next step is to go in with the pure undiluted solvent and to wipe away any of the excess pigment from any of the highlight areas on the model. You just need to make sure that you're keeping your brush clean, and every time you do go in and wipe away any of the weathering pigment, just wipe your brush off on a paper towel, then go back in with some fresh solvent and start work on the next highlight area. Also at this stage you're going to want to make sure you're taking care of any areas with excessive pooling, and just make sure that you're wicking out any of this excess pigment that's building up around the bottom areas of the model. And the same goes for the Wraith Riders as well. Just slowly use the solvent to uncover any of the highlights on the model. And again, this is where the gloss varnish really pays off, as it makes this stage a lot easier to wick up the paint in comparison to the matte varnish. It's actually something I didn't realise. Matte varnish creates a rough surface, whereas gloss varnish creates a smooth surface. And that's exactly what we want here. And while all of the shade is drying on the models, it's time to tackle the Wraith heads. And I'm going to be switching back to the airbrush for this. and I'm going to be airbrushing in a few of the colours from the Vivid Blue Triad. And the idea here is that we want to apply a small blue highlight to the centre of the helmet and also the very top tip of the helmet as well. And I'm just going to start with Royal Blue and then apply a final spot highlight of Arctic Gem. Next up, it's time to add some of the magenta accent colour to the Wraith Rider model. And to do that, I'm just going to be using the exact same magenta triad that I used for the Wraith Guardian sword. And I'm following the exact same process here by applying a solid base coat of the darkest colour Diabolic Plumb, and then just glazing my way up through the triad, slowly building up the highlights. And once that's done, you should be left with some really nicely shaded models with some nicely glazed up magenta highlights. And I did apply a coat of matte varnish to all of the models as well, just to make sure I took away all of the shine from the gloss varnish and from the weathering pigment. And next it's time to super glue on the custom Wraith helmets to all of the Guardian and Rider models. And that's the model complete and ready to be based with the Magic Temple resin bases. And I hope you enjoyed this little Wraith army conversion. And if you do want a more in-depth tutorial on how I paint up these custom Wraith Eldari in the Craftworld Mymeara colour scheme, then you can always check out one of my previous videos on how I painted up the Wraith Blades and the Wraith Knight. But anyway, thanks for joining me again, and as always, I hope you found this video useful. And if you did, make sure to give it a like. And I have plenty more upcoming videos, so don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.